Now, in view of this entire disenfranchisement of one half the people of this country, their social and religious degradation, in view of the unjust laws above mentioned, and because women do feel themselves aggrieved, oppressed, and fraudulently deprived of their most sacred rights, we insist that they have immediate admission to all the rights and privileges which belong to them as citizens of these United States.
Mrs. Banks! Cast off the shackles of yesterday, shoulder to shoulder into the fray. Our daughters will adore us.
American society's devotion to ameliorating the lives of its citizens took the charge right after the issues of the Gilded Age. This progressive era introduced the idea of social reform, promoting the idea of equality for all sorts of groups, including those in lower socioeconomic classes and women across the nation. For years, women had few rights and were barely considered citizens of the country. They had no access to higher education, so the scientific fields were completely restricted to men. Jobs requiring a degree were unavailable to women, as well as many other jobs. Those women who were able to get paid were paid much less than the male employees. Married women had no rights to property. They had to depend completely on their husbands and the men in their life. Men had complete control over women, deciding what a woman did with her life, even imprisoning her if he felt like it. Husbands were permitted to beat their wives with impunity. But during the Progressive Era, women began to break free of their oppressive role in society. The Progressive Era in United States history spanned the late 1800s and early 1900s. During this period, the country was transforming into an opportunity-abundant, self-sustaining environment. At this time, new ideas, new people, new political opinions, and new organizations emerged. In the midst of all this, social reform and women's rights took center stage. Women like Alice Paul, Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Susan B. Anthony stood at the front of the movement, organizing, writing, and speaking for their cause. The movement begins. One of the most critical points of the women's rights movement occurred at the 1840 World Anti-Slavery Convention in London. It was here that Elizabeth Cady Stanton met Lucretia Mott, a prominent American abolitionist. These two women were both frustrated at being barred from participating in the convention because of their gender. They decided that they would hold a women's rights convention in order to address issues such as this. 8 years later, this idea became a reality. In 1848, in Seneca Falls, Mott, Stanton, and 300 others met to discuss the future of the women's rights movement. Conventions were held annually after this, providing a focus for the growing women's rights movement in America.
Between 1907 and 1910, I found my passion for fighting for women's rights when I was studying at a training school for Quakers in Woodbridge, England. In 1910, I earned my PhD in sociology from the University of Pennsylvania, and I worked for NASA for 2 years.
The National American Women's Suffrage Association, or NASA, was an organization that led the fight for women's suffrage during the 20th century. Formed in February of 1890, the organization pushed for the creation of the 19th Amendment. They traveled from state to state to campaign for the enfranchisement of women, and they had local and national journals that wrote pro-suffrage articles for newspapers around the country. They also lobbied Congress officials as well as President Woodrow Wilson to pass an amendment that allowed women to vote. On March 3, 1913, Alice Paul led a march of 8,000 women down Pennsylvania Avenue from the Capitol to the White House, picketing and protesting for women's suffrage. Her and her party were arrested.
However, my spirit did not burn out while I was in jail. I went on a hunger strike in my cell, which drove everyone crazy, and they had to force feed me. However, it was worth it because in the end, President Woodrow Wilson finally took action for women's suffrage.
Finally, on May 21, 1919, a House resolution to approve the amendment that would allow women the right to vote was proposed. The Senate ratified it 2 weeks later, leaving the states to vote on whether to ratify the amendment. The deciding vote came down to Tennessee, and the deciding vote of Tennessee was left to Harry T. Byrne, who was opposed to the amendment. Despite this, Byrne voted to ratify the amendment because his mother convinced him to in a letter. And so, on August 18, 1920, the 19th Amendment was ratified and women gained the right to vote in the United States of America. Alice Paul left NASA and co-founded the Congressional Union in 1914, dedicated to seeking a federal constitutional amendment for women's suffrage. She founded the National Women's Party in 1916. Finally, in 1923, she proposed an Equal Rights Amendment to the Constitution. Alongside the women's rights movement, a new culture called the New Woman arose. Before, women were confined to the limited traditional roles as wives and mothers, so the New Woman was an ideal that allowed them to expand their social roles. Women were not marrying as early as the generations before them, and they began wearing bloomers instead of long dresses. They began joining the workforce and were free to go wherever, whenever they wanted. Women like Margaret Sanger, who had been promoting birth control and supporting it, took this opportunity to do more, building and opening birth control clinics despite the danger and the law banning contraceptive instituted in 1873. Sanger's first public birth control clinic was opened in 1916. 9 days later, it was raided by police and Sanger was arrested. Years before this, Sanger was indicted for sending diaphragms through the mail to other women. Without effective or even legal forms of birth control, women went through many unwanted and painful pregnancies. Often they would resort to back alley abortions that more commonly than a successful abortion would lead to the woman needing to go into a hospital for emergency care. Sanger eventually formed the American Birth Control League, the predecessor of Planned Parenthood, and continued fighting with like-minded women for better forms of birth control to keep away unwanted pregnancies. However, this change in women morals was not without its backlash. Many newspapers were mocking the new movement and called for society to return to old morals and principles. Many political cartoons and articles were published as an attempt to stop the New Woman movement, but were unsuccessful as women continued to pursue the fight, not only to protect their new ideals, but to be able to enjoy the fruits of gender equality. Women and the women's rights movement gained a lot of traction and got a lot done in the progressive era, but there are still battles and struggles to get equal treatment even today. Emily N. Blair, a Missouri suffragist and the vice president of the Democratic National Committee beginning in 1924, once observed the fact that is even still relevant today.
Women were welcome to come in as workers, but not as co-makers of the world. For all their numbers, they seldom rose to positions of responsibility or power. The few who did fit into the system as they found it, all standards, all methods, all values, continued to be set by men.